I would like to acknowledge the land I'm presenting on today is the land of the Kaurna people, and I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you are on today, and extend my respect to all First Nations people present. I will start by explaining why I undertook this research. I've been the victim representative on the Parole Board of South Australia since 2015. And in this role, I've participated in hundreds of face-to-face interviews. From this work, I identified that people who chronically offend often have histories of trauma. Many people applying for parole have no sense of a good life or a pro-social self-identity. The prevalence of unresolved trauma in the lives of people who offend reflect their parents' lives and their children's lives, and it led me to question the ways the criminal justice system was responding. My PhD research explored the idea that sentencing outcomes may significantly improve if judicial officers were trauma-informed. Trauma-informed practice requires that service providers understand and recognise trauma and its impacts and respond in a manner that is person-centred, strengths-based, and seeks to further empower the individual and actively prevent re-traumatisation. Trauma-informed sentencing requires that judges first realise the presence of adversity and trauma in defendants' lives. Second, recognise trauma's relevance to criminal behaviour. Third, respond in a way that is informed by trauma in terms of both a trauma-informed process characterised by the 5 principles of practice, namely safety, trustworthiness, empowerment, collaboration and choice, as well as impose a trauma-informed sanction. And finally, judges were required to resist re-traumatisation. Little is currently known about if, when and how trauma-informed sentencing occurs. Sentencing plays an important role in how the criminal justice system responds to crime, by imposing sanctions designed to punish people who offend, reduce future crime, and consequently improve community safety. In reaching a decision about sentence, judges must consider the sentencing calculus, which comprises sentencing purposes, principles, individual factors, and non-legal considerations. Applying the sentencing calculus is not straightforward. Sentencing purposes are not always complementary, and in South Australia, the principal purpose of sentencing is to protect the safety of the community, but how to do this may be widely interpreted. Judges have a great deal of discretion and currently recognise victim trauma in terms of the impact of crime on a victim's well-being. Defendant trauma may also influence sentencing. There is no universally accepted definition or understanding of the concept of trauma. I define trauma as the impact of adversity on an individual's functioning and well-being. Adversity includes acute traumatic events that are overwhelming and uncontrollable, as well as chronic, repeated, or ongoing potentially traumatic experiences. Many people experience adversity and most have the internal and external resources to manage and resolve its traumatic impact. For people entrenched in the criminal justice system, often their trajectory into further criminality is influenced by the ongoing impact of unresolved trauma in terms of criminogenic risks. Trauma is a risk factor for crime. Correctional intervention programs across the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and other common law jurisdictions are designed to target risk factors that increase the likelihood of criminal behaviour, which are also known as criminogenic needs. These programs are underpinned by the risks, needs, responsivity model of Don Andrews and James Bonter. Trauma has been found to contribute to antisocial and criminal behaviour and attitudes, to family and relationship problems, problems with social achievement, engagement in education and employment, a lack of pro-social activities, and also substance abuse issues. My thesis drew from a sample of sentencing remarks. Sentencing remarks can bring transparency to judicial decision-making by outlining the elements in the sentencing calculus relied on in reaching a decision, enabling sentencing to be better understood by the public. I undertook content analysis of 448 sentencing remarks that I downloaded from 2019 to establish how often trauma was mentioned, and then I used thematic analysis to understand how judges conceptualise trauma. Adversity was explicitly realised by judicial officers in 233 defendants' lives, or in 52% of the sample. As can be seen from the slide, and as expected, the largest sample of defendants were non-Aboriginal men. For 56% of non-Aboriginal men, judges did not realise traumatic stresses were present in their lives. For most Aboriginal and female defendants, and all female Aboriginal defendants, judges realised adversity was present in their lives. Because sentencing remarks are designed to provide the reasoning behind sentencing decisions, the percentage of the original sample of remarks which did not acknowledge adversity cannot be used as a measure of the proportion of defendants who have not experienced trauma. Rather, the included remarks are merely an indication of where the judges realised adversity was present in the defendants' lives and where it was notable enough to be included in the sentencing remarks. Judges realised that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, characterise the childhoods of people who offended, including chronic and repeated child abuse and neglect, which often resulted in homelessness and/or out-of-home care, household mental illness, including parental and sibling suicidality, household substance abuse, often compounded by other dysfunctions such as domestic abuse and family hardships, domestic abuse, which often involved serial exposure to personal and maternal victimisation, violence and abuse perpetrated by birth fathers, stepfathers, and mothers' boyfriends, and incarcerated household members and parental separation or divorce, which were less commonly referred to than parental absence due to abandonment or death. Defendants also experienced war and displacement, and as adults were also exposed to domestic abuse, violence and injury, and family breakdowns. Quotes from sentencing remarks included, "You are the product of a devastating long-term effect of serial child abuse of one sort or another. When you were 14, you came home from school to find your parents had left for interstate. You found your father deceased during an access visit when you were only 13. At age 9, you witnessed your father's suicide. You had a very dysfunctional and difficult relationship with your biological mother, who was a drug addict and who was absent and neglectful of you during your childhood. On 2 occasions, she left as what you would describe as collateral with a drug dealer for debts owed, and you were subjected to abuse during those times." While judges acknowledged a diversity of traumatic events in defendants' lives, they were less likely to overtly recognise how the traumatic impact of the adversity was associated with criminal behaviour. In 47% of sentencing remarks, judges recognised a relationship between trauma and crime. There were 3 key characteristics of trauma associated with criminal behaviour. First, the adversity was recent and significant. Second, the trauma resulted in mental health diagnoses, such as borderline personality disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And when the trauma manifested as substance dependency, it was closely associated with criminal behaviour. In making the link between trauma, mental health, and criminal behaviour, judges relied on expert evidence, their own interpretation of that evidence, as well as what could be described as common sense understanding of the traumatic impact of adversity on mental health, well-being, and functioning. Sometimes, judges recognised a trauma-crime association, but rejected it, stating that it explained but did not excuse the offending. This was true in some cases even when expert evidence highlighted a link between unresolved complex trauma and criminality. A trauma-informed sentencing response comprised both a trauma-informed process through the application of trauma-informed principles of practice, as well as a trauma-informed sanction. To identify a trauma-informed process, the content of sentencing remarks was used as a proxy measure of each principle of practice as follows. Safety was represented by judges referring to the defendants directly and by name. Trustworthiness of judges was indicated when judges explained an element of sentencing process to the defendant. Safety and empowerment occurred when judges asked the defendant whether they understood the sentencing sanction. And choice, collaboration, and empowerment were represented by judges asking defendants whether they accepted and would abide by the sentencing decision. The sentencing process for 27.5% of defendants was characterised by all 5 principles of practice. One or more of the trauma-informed principles of practice was present in 67% of the 233 sentencing remarks where trauma had been realised. A trauma-informed sentencing sanction required an overt judicial statement that indicated an adjustment of sanction in response to the defendant's trauma history. In adjusting the sanction imposed to account for trauma, judges tended to either downgrade the sanction from incarceration to a community-based penalty or reduce the length of imprisonment. While such sentences were well-intentioned, they were not necessarily evidence-informed. For example, non-custodial sentences have been found to be more effective in reducing recidivism than prison sentences shorter than 12 months. In 30% of sentencing remarks, judges acknowledged a lengthy prison sentence would lead to traumatic impacts on the defendant or the defendant's children or other dependents. Parental incarceration is an adverse childhood experience that may have a significant impact on children and their trajectory into the child protection system, out-of-home care, and the criminal justice system. My thesis included 10 recommendations, including judicial and public education, the re-establishment of the Sentencing Advisory Council in South Australia, more targeted expert reports, amendments to how sentencing remarks are drafted and accessed, and a whole of criminal justice system response that is trauma-informed. A week after I submitted my thesis, I presented at a Judicial Development Day in South Australia. From speaking with 20 judicial officers, I learnt that many of the barriers to trauma-informed sentencing do not sit with the judges themselves, but relate to broader systemic issues. The judges and magistrates indicated that they supported and used trauma-informed sentencing practices, but were hampered by insufficient funding for defence lawyers to provide better expert reports, mandatory sentencing legislation that requires 4/5 of a sentence be spent in custody, and appeal court requirements and language conventions that they have to abide by in their sentencing remarks. I submitted my thesis in October for assessment, and so it remains a living document for now. I have published other papers which relate to this research which may be of interest, and some of those are listed on this slide. I would also like to thank my supervisory panel, as pro Ben Livings, Emeritus Professor Rick Saar at UniSA, and particularly Professor Andrew Day and Dr. Judith DeLang, who went above and beyond to support me through the PhD process.